The crystal chandeliers cast cold light across the mahogany conference table, their reflections fragmenting in the polished surface like broken promises. Serena Whitmore, the blonde CEO whose presence commanded boardrooms from Manhattan to Silicon Valley, found herself cornered by hostile shareholders, a forced contract placed before her like a death warrant. Strange security guards locked the doors with mechanical precision, while cameras blinked off one by one, their red recording lights dying in sequence. As the lead conspirator leaned forward to press his advantage, the heavy oak doors burst open with explosive force. Carter Miller, former Navy SEAL and single father, stepped through in a dark suit that couldn't hide the lethal grace of his movements. His eyes, like tempered steel cutting through the tension, he spoke slowly, clearly, each word dropping like a hammer on anvil. "Hands off the lady." The room froze, suspended between heartbeats, as if the universe itself had paused to listen. Whitmore Holdings towered 47 stories above the financial district, its glass and steel facade reflecting the ambitions and betrayals that played out within. The boardroom on the top floor had witnessed billion-dollar deals and corporate massacres. But nothing quite like what was unfolding this September morning. Serena Whitmore had inherited the company at 28 when her father died suddenly, transforming it from a regional player into a clean energy powerhouse that threatened established interests. At 34, she possessed the kind of beauty that made men underestimate her intelligence, her golden hair falling in waves past her shoulders. Today, wearing a red dress with a professional V-neck that spoke of confidence without compromise, her mission was clear: close the revolutionary clean energy R&D deal that would position Whitmore Holdings at the forefront of sustainable technology, while protecting the transparent corporate culture she had cultivated against all odds. But transparency made enemies, and Serena's insistence on ethical practices had isolated her within her own board. The vultures had been circling for months, manipulating procedural rules, planting seeds of doubt among investors. She was brilliant, decisive, and utterly alone in a room full of people who smiled while sharpening their knives behind their backs. 3 floors below, Carter Miller adjusted his security badge for the 100th time that morning. At 36, he carried himself with the controlled economy of movement that marked elite warriors even in civilian clothes. His shoulders were broad, his hands scarred from years of service. But his eyes held a gentleness that emerged only when he looked at his 7-year-old daughter, Audrey. The private security gig was supposed to be simple, a short-term contract to cover bills while he figured out his next move. Single fatherhood hadn't been part of the plan when his wife died 2 years ago in a car accident, leaving him to navigate homework and bedtime stories instead of hostile territories. His principles were carved in stone by years of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Never leave the weak undefended. Never let a victim stand alone. These weren't just words from a training manual, but a code written in the blood and sacrifice of brothers who hadn't made it home. Today was supposed to be routine, building security for a corporate meeting. Nothing that would complicate his life or compromise his ability to pick up Audrey from the building's childcare center at noon. Above them all, Damian Cross commanded the boardroom with the predatory patience of a spider in its web. At 40, he was tall and gaunt, his gray suit matching the cold calculation in his gray eyes. As the largest shareholder after Serena, he had spent 18 months orchestrating this moment, weaving together legal manipulations and financial pressure points with surgical precision. His network included compromised security personnel and a legal counsel whose loyalty could be bought for the right price. The endgame was elegant in its brutality. Force Serena to sign over control, then sell the company's core data and patents to foreign competitors for a sum that would make him wealthy beyond imagination. The supporting cast moved through their roles, with varying degrees of complicity and awareness. Henry Caldwell, the internal legal counsel ostensibly paid by the board, had perfected the art of serving 2 masters while appearing to serve justice. His thin face and nervous habits masked a sharp legal mind that had found every loophole in corporate governance. Vivian Brooks, the CFO, maintained careful neutrality, her allegiance flowing toward whoever held power like water seeking its level. She was competent, calculating, and utterly without conviction beyond protecting her own position. In the IT department, 3 floors down, Liam Torres hunched over his monitoring station, his professional conscience increasingly troubled by anomalies in the system logs. The 28-year-old data engineer had noticed unauthorized access attempts, strange patterns in the security footage archives, and most recently, evidence that someone had pulled complete copies of the R&D database at 2:17 in the morning. Alexandra Pierce, the most moderate board member, sat in the boardroom reviewing documents, her 60 years of experience in corporate governance telling her something was fundamentally wrong with this emergency meeting, though she couldn't quite place what. The seeds of conspiracy had been planted weeks earlier. Security cameras throughout the building had experienced mysterious glitches, always explained away as routine maintenance. The regular security team had been given unexpected schedule changes, replaced by new faces with credentials that looked right at first glance but wouldn't bear close scrutiny. The emergency meeting requests had cascaded through email systems with increasing urgency, each one ratcheting up the pressure while providing less time for proper preparation or review. Serena's assistant knocked on her office door at 8:45 that morning, her face pale with concern. The emergency board meeting had been called to address urgent legal risks that required immediate action, but the documentation was thin, the justification vague. Protocol demanded attendance, but every instinct Serena had developed in 6 years of CEO battles screamed danger. She gathered her materials, her tablet containing the clean energy proposal that should have been the day's real focus, and made her way to the boardroom, her heels clicking against marble with metronomic precision. Carter had just settled Audrey in the building's childcare center. A bright space, filled with books and educational toys, that justified the premium rent Whitmore Holdings paid for the top floors. His daughter hugged him tight, her small arms barely reaching around his waist, before running off to join a reading circle. He promised to return in 90 minutes, a promise he intended to keep despite the unease crawling up his spine. Something about today felt wrong, the kind of wrong he'd learned to recognize in Afghanistan when the air itself seemed to hold its breath before an ambush. His trained eyes caught details others missed. The security badge on the new guard at the elevator bank used a slightly different font than the official ones, a discrepancy so small most would never notice. Another guard wore an earpiece from a different manufacturer than the building's standard equipment, the kind of mixing of systems that suggested hasty assembly rather than professional planning. These men moved with the aggressive confidence of hired muscle, rather than the measured professionalism of trained security personnel. Carter made his rounds, checking emergency exits and monitoring posts, his unease growing with each observation. Near the executive floor's utility closet, he noticed fresh scratches on the access panel screws, evidence of recent tampering. Inside, splice marks on the cables suggested someone had inserted devices into the building's communication infrastructure. He memorized the locations, choosing not to act immediately, wanting to understand the full scope of what was happening before showing his hand. The boardroom filled with calculated precision, each member taking their assigned seat in a choreography of corporate power. Serena entered last, by design, forcing her to take the seat furthest from the door, boxed in by the conference table and her supposed colleagues. The smart glass windows activated, turning opaque, cutting off the outside world. The door locks engaged with soft electronic clicks that might have been missed if not for the sudden silence that followed. One by one, the security cameras in the corners of the room blinked off, their indicator lights dying like stars at dawn. Henry Caldwell cleared his throat, shuffling papers with practiced nervousness that masked his real purpose. He began outlining legal risks that were more fiction than fact, building toward a recommendation that emergency powers be granted to a crisis management committee that would, coincidentally, be headed by Damian Cross. The language was dense, designed to confuse rather than clarify, each clause a trap waiting to be sprung. Serena's requests for independent legal review were deflected with procedural justifications, internal protocols that had been quietly amended in previous meetings she had been unable to attend. The pressure in the room built like a storm system, invisible but undeniable. Damian leaned back in his chair, letting Henry do the dirty work while maintaining plausible deniability. Other board members shifted uncomfortably, some genuinely unaware of the full plot, others complicit but nervous about the execution. The contract was pushed across the table towards Serena, a gold pen placed beside it like an executioner's axe. Meanwhile, Carter had reached the utility access point, his decision made. The SEAL training that had kept him alive through 43 combat missions took over. Muscle memory and tactical assessment merging into action. He could disable the signal jammer, restore the cameras, and create an evidence trail, but it would mean abandoning his post and potentially putting himself in direct conflict with the fake security team. The mathematics of risk had changed the moment he recognized this as a coordinated attack on a defenseless target. His mind flickered to a mission 4 years ago in Kandahar province. They had been 60 seconds late reaching an extraction point, just 1 minute that had meant the difference between a successful rescue and finding a dead asset. The image of that failure, the weight of arriving too late, had haunted him through sleepless nights and driven him from active service. He had sworn never to be late again. Never to let caution override action when innocent lives hung in the balance. But there was Audrey to consider. Safe for now in the childcare center, but vulnerable if he made enemies of whoever was orchestrating this corporate coup. The conflict between father and warrior, between self-preservation and duty, lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. Then his hands were moving, pulling the signal jammer from its hiding spot, triggering the building's backup systems that would restore camera function and create an electronic record of everything happening in the boardroom. The first security guard found him as he was replacing the access panel, a mountain of a man with prison tattoos barely hidden by his collar. The confrontation was brief and violent, though Carter kept it controlled, using close-quarters combat techniques that neutralized without causing permanent damage. A blood choke, held for exactly 8 seconds, dropped the man unconscious. Zip ties from Carter's kit, securing hands and feet. The second guard came investigating the noise, meeting a similar fate through a combination of joint locks and pressure points that spoke of years of specialized training. Carter took the elevator to the executive floor, his commandeered security badge providing access. The boardroom door was sealed, but the override codes he had memorized during his security briefing still worked. Oversight by the conspirators who had focused on controlling the room from inside rather than preventing entry from outside. The heavy doors burst open with enough force to slam against the walls, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the tense atmosphere. Every head turned toward him, faces displaying a spectrum from shock to rage to desperate hope. Carter stepped into the room, his presence filling the space with an authority that had nothing to do with corporate hierarchy and everything to do with controlled violence held in perfect check. His gaze swept the room, cataloging threats and allies in milliseconds, before locking onto Damian Cross with the focused intensity of a targeting laser. "Hands off the lady," he said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of a man who had faced death and found it wanting. The words hung in the air, a challenge and a promise wrapped in 4 simple syllables that changed everything. Damian's recovery was swift, his smile sharp as broken glass. "I believe you're lost. This is a private board meeting, and security guards, even temporary ones, aren't welcome here." The dismissal was calculated to minimize Carter's intervention, to reframe him as an irrelevant interruption rather than a game-changing presence. Carter didn't respond to Damian directly, instead addressing Serena with professional courtesy that carried deeper currents. "Ma'am, I've documented multiple security breaches in this building, including tampering with surveillance systems and the presence of unauthorized personnel. Under Section 4 of the Corporate Safety Protocols, any meeting conducted under potential duress or security compromise must be immediately suspended pending a full investigation." The legal framework gave Serena the opening she needed. Rising from her chair with renewed authority, she seized the momentum Carter had created. "Mr. Caldwell, as our legal counsel, I'm sure you're aware that any contracts or resolutions passed under the conditions described would be legally null and void. I motion for immediate suspension of this meeting pending security review," Henry stammered, his carefully prepared arguments crumbling against this unexpected vector of attack. That's an overreach. Simple technical difficulties don't constitute grounds for suspension. But his voice lacked conviction, the script he had memorized suddenly useless in this new reality. Carter pulled out his phone, swiping through images he had captured during his investigation. Technical difficulties don't usually involve hardware spliced into the building's communication systems. The photos appeared on the boardroom's presentation screen. His phone synced to the room's display system. They also don't explain why 217 this morning, someone with administrator access downloaded the entire R&D database. Liam Torres, who had been invited to the meeting as a technical advisor, suddenly straightened in his chair. 217? I have those logs, the MAC address of the accessing device. His fingers flew across his tablet, pulling up data that had been troubling him for days. It matches Mr. Caldwell's laptop. The room erupted into chaos, accusations and denials flying like shrapnel. Henry's face drained of color as he babbled about legitimate security testing and legal review requirements. Damien's controlled facade began to crack, his gray eyes darting between exits and allies, calculating if the plan could still be salvaged. Vivian Brooks, the CFO, who had remained silent until now, finally chose a side. If there's been unauthorized access to financial and technical data, the fiduciary risk to this company is catastrophic. I need to see all relevant documentation immediately. Her shift was subtle but decisive, the balance of power in the room tilting towards Serena. Carter had retrieved a USB drive from one of the unconscious guards, plugging it into the boardroom system with deliberate ceremony. The files it contained were damning, complete copies of the stolen data, the script for today's meeting including predetermined outcomes, and most devastatingly, draft contracts with a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands for the sale of Whitmore Holdings' intellectual property. These timestamps match our system logs exactly, Liam confirmed, his voice gaining strength as he realized he was no longer a lone voice pointing out irregularities. This was coordinated, planned weeks in advance. Alexandra Pierce, who had been reviewing the evidence with the careful attention of someone who had survived 40 years of corporate politics, finally spoke. I've seen hostile takeovers, but this is corporate espionage and conspiracy to commit fraud. Damien, I gave you the benefit of the doubt, but this evidence is overwhelming. Damien's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the cold fury beneath. He pulled out his phone, swiping to an image that made Carter's blood freeze. It showed Audrey in the childcare center, taken from an angle that suggested surveillance from inside the room. Accidents happen in buildings every day, Damien said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout. Tragic accidents, especially to children who wander where they shouldn't. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Carter's hands clenched into fists, every instinct screaming to eliminate the threat. But his tactical mind recognized the trap. Any violence now would undermine everything, potentially letting Damien's conspirators escape while Carter was arrested for assault. The mission parameters had changed. This was no longer just about saving Serena's company, but protecting his daughter from immediate danger. Serena's response was swift and unexpected. She pulled out her personal phone, dialing a number from memory. Andrea? This is Serena Whitmore. Yes, I know you're off shift, but we have a Code 7 situation in the executive boardroom. There's a credible threat against the child in your facility's care center. Her name is Audrey Miller. Please implement immediate protective protocols. The name Andrea Collins meant something to Carter, though he couldn't immediately place it. Serena caught his look and explained quietly. Andrea is the building's senior security chief. Her husband was Michael Collins, Navy SEAL Team 4, killed in action 3 years ago. I've been quietly funding an education trust for their children. She understands what it means to protect a warrior's family. The revelation reframed everything Carter thought he knew about Serena Whitmore. This wasn't just a CEO protecting her company, but someone who understood sacrifice and loyalty at a level that transcended corporate politics. Damien's threat had backfired, creating an alliance he hadn't anticipated. Mr. Cross, Serena said, her voice carrying new steel. You've just added criminal threatening and conspiracy to harm a minor to your growing list of charges. I believe that triggers the immediate suspension clause in our corporate bylaws, the one that states any board member under criminal investigation is automatically recused from voting pending resolution. Carter saw the opening and took it. There's also the matter of the stop-the-clock provision, he said, remembering obscure corporate law from his security briefing. When there's evidence of coercion or threats during a board meeting, any member can invoke immediate suspension pending ethics review. The provision requires only 2 board members to activate. I second the motion, Alexandra said immediately, her voice firm with conviction. Third, Vivian added, completing the required quorum. The legal machinery Damien had tried to subvert now worked against him. Serena activated the Emergency Ethics Committee through a recorded conference call, creating an unassailable legal record. The committee consisted of herself, Alexandra, and Vivian, enough to constitute legitimate corporate authority. Every word was being recorded, every action documented. Carter's phone buzzed with a message from Andrea Collins. Package secure. 2 attempted intrusions neutralized. Metro and federal law enforcement en route. The relief was overwhelming. But he kept his expression neutral, not wanting to give Damien any information about the status of his threats. "You know," Carter said conversationally, his tone deliberately casual, as he addressed Damien. "In my experience, people who make threats often forget they're being recorded." He gestured to the cameras that had mysteriously reactivated, their red lights blinking steadily. "They also forget that conspiracy charges become federal cases when they cross state lines or involve wire fraud. That shell company in the Caymans? That makes this FBI jurisdiction." Damien's phone rang, his lawyer on the other end, delivering what was obviously catastrophic news. Federal agents were already in the building, Andrea Collins having contacted them the moment the threat was made against Audrey. The carefully constructed conspiracy was collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. "There's something else you should know," Serena said, producing her tablet with the clean energy proposal still displayed. "This entire meeting has been live-streamed to our secure legal archive since Mr. Miller restored the cameras. Every word, every threat, every admission of guilt is already in federal custody. You mentioned something about commission rates with that shell company, Damien. Would you like to elaborate on that for the record?" The trap was perfect, utilizing the very technology Damien had tried to subvert. His own words, his own threats, had created the evidence needed for prosecution. The attempting to maintain control had become the very rope that would hang him. "I want my lawyer," Damien said, but the words were hollow, empty of their usual force. "He's probably busy," Carter observed. "The FBI tends to execute multiple warrants simultaneously in conspiracy cases. Your home, office, that shell company's registered address, even if it's just a post office box. They're all being searched right now." The boardroom doors opened again, but this time it was federal agents in blue windbreakers with FBI emblazoned in yellow letters. They moved with professional efficiency, reading rights and applying handcuffs with practiced ease. Damien Cross, who had entered the room expecting to steal a company, left it in federal custody facing charges that would likely result in decades of imprisonment. Henry Caldwell tried to slip out during the confusion, but Carter had positioned himself strategically. A gentle hand on the lawyer's shoulder was enough to stop him until agents could take over. Henry's protests about legal review and professional obligations fell on deaf ears as evidence of his 217 unauthorized access was presented. The cuffs clicked shut on wrists that had signed too many corrupt documents, typed too many fraudulent agreements. Vivian had already begun the financial audit, her fingers flying across her tablet as she documented every irregular transaction, every suspicious transfer that could be linked to the conspiracy. Her cooperation would likely keep her out of prison, though her career at Whitmore Holdings was certainly over. She understood the mathematics of survival and had chosen accordingly. Alexandra stood at the head of the table, her age and experience lending gravitas to her words. "I call for an immediate vote of no confidence in Damien Cross and Henry Caldwell, striking them from all positions within Whitmore Holdings and its subsidiaries." The vote was unanimous among the remaining board members, even those who had been sympathetic to Damien now distancing themselves from the toxic association. "I also move to confirm Serena Whitmore as CEO with full authority restored, and to commend her handling of this crisis," Alexandra continued. Again, unanimous approval, though some votes came more readily than others. The FBI agents were thorough but efficient, collecting evidence and taking statements with the kind of professional competence that suggested this wasn't their first corporate corruption case. Within 30 minutes, the conspirators were gone. The boardroom was a crime scene being processed, and the immediate danger had passed. Carter slipped out during the chaos of documentation and evidence collection. His job was done, his contract technically fulfilled, and he had no desire for the spotlight that would inevitably follow. The media would arrive soon, turning this corporate coup attempt into a circus of speculation and analysis. He had Audrey to think about, a promise to keep about picking her up on time, but Serena found him at the elevator, having extricated herself from the investigators long enough to catch him before he disappeared. They stood there for a moment, CEO and security guard, though both knew those labels barely scratched the surface of what had just transpired. "Thank you," she said simply, but the words carried weight that transcended their simplicity. "Just doing my job," Carter replied, though they both knew that was a lie. His job hadn't required him to risk everything, to choose intervention over safety, to stand between her and the wolves. I read your file, Serena admitted. When you applied for the security position, former SEAL Team 6, Silver, Star, Purple Heart, widowed, raising a daughter alone. You could have had any security position in the city, probably running entire departments. Why here? Why temporary work? Carter considered his answer carefully. Sometimes, the small jobs matter more than the big ones. Sometimes, protecting one person makes more difference than protecting thousands. The elevator arrived, its doors opening with a soft chime that seemed to mark the end of something and the beginning of something else. Carter stepped inside, but Serena caught the door before it could close. I'm going to need a new head of security, she said. Someone I can trust absolutely. Someone who understands that protecting a company means protecting its people, not just its assets. The position comes with full benefits, educational trust for dependents, and the understanding that family always comes first. Carter thought about Audrey, about stability and health insurance and college funds. He thought about honor and duty and the weight of promises made. I'll think about it, he said, though his small smile suggested the decision was already made. Serena released the elevator door and stepped back. By the way, your daughter is in the executive conference room with Andrea. She's been reading to some of the younger children. Something about ocean adventures and brave sailors. Apparently, she's quite the storyteller. The elevator doors began to close, but Carter heard Serena's final words. Like father, like daughter. The descent to the childcare level gave Carter time to process everything that had happened in less than 2 hours. A routine security shift had become a battle for corporate control. A father's protective instinct had overcome professional caution, and somehow, in the chaos of threats and legal maneuvering, justice had prevailed. It wasn't the clean victory of military operations, where objectives were clear and success measurable. This was messier, more complex, with implications that would ripple through courts and boardrooms for months to come. Andrea Collins stood outside the executive conference room, her bearing immediately recognizable as someone who had lived with military precision even as a civilian. She was in her 40s, strong and steady, the kind of person who had learned to carry grief without letting it break her. The recognition was mutual and immediate, two people who understood loss and duty meeting across the divide of their different battles. Your daughter is remarkable, Andrea said without preamble. When we had to implement security protocols, she immediately started helping with the younger children, keeping them calm and distracted. She said her daddy taught her that being brave means helping others when they're scared. Through the conference room's glass wall, Carter could see Audrey sitting cross-legged on the carpet, surrounded by a semicircle of younger children, holding a picture book about marine life. Her animated gestures suggested she was adding her own embellishments to the story, probably including details about Navy SEALs that weren't in the original text. The sight hit him with unexpected force. This small person who had become his entire world, demonstrating the same protective instincts that had defined his military career. She's had to grow up fast, Carter said quietly. They all do, Andrea replied. And in those 3 words was a shared understanding of what it meant to raise children who had lost a parent to service, whether military or medical. The conference room door opened and Audrey spotted him immediately, her face lighting up with the pure joy that only children can manifest. She carefully closed the book, said goodbye to each child individually, then walked to her father with the dignity of someone much older, before throwing herself into his arms with 7-year-old enthusiasm. Daddy. Miss Andrea said there was an emergency drill, but I knew it wasn't a drill because you taught me what real emergencies feel like. So, I helped keep the little kids calm. Did I do good? You did perfect, sweetheart, Carter said, holding her tight, feeling the weight of what could have been lost if things had gone differently. Serena appeared in the doorway, having finally escaped the federal agents and initial media responses. She had kicked off her heels somewhere, standing in stocking feet that made her seem more human, less corporate titan. The red dress that had been armor in the boardroom now just made her look tired and triumphant in equal measure. Miss Audrey, Serena said, dropping to the child's eye level with natural grace. I heard you were very brave today. Thank you for taking care of the younger children. Audrey studied Serena with the direct gaze children have before social conditioning teaches them to look away. You're the boss, lady, she said. Daddy helped you today, didn't he? He's good at helping people. That's what SEALs do. Yes, he did help me, Serena confirmed. Your daddy is a hero, though I suspect you already knew that. He doesn't like being called that, Audrey said matter-of-factly. He says heroes are the ones who don't come home. He came home, so he's just daddy. The words hung in the air, profound in their simplicity. Serena's eyes met Carter's over Audrey's head, and in that glance was understanding that transcended their different worlds. They both knew about loss, about sacrifice, about the weight of carrying on when others couldn't. I have something for you, Serena said to Audrey, producing a beautifully illustrated book about ocean exploration from her bag. It's about the deep sea, where the bravest explorers go. I thought you might enjoy it. Audrey accepted the book with both hands, the way her father had taught her to receive gifts, with respect and gratitude. Thank you, Miss Serena. Will you? Will you come read it with us sometime? The question was innocent, but Carter saw Serena's slight hesitation, the moment where personal and professional boundaries blurred. I would like that very much, she finally said, and meant it. They rode the elevator down together, an unlikely trio united by a morning's chaos. The lobby was already filling with reporters and law enforcement, the aftermath of corporate conspiracy playing out in real time. But there was a side exit, a quiet path to the parking garage that avoided the circus. The offer stands, Serena said as they reached Carter's practical sedan. So different from the luxury vehicles in the executive section. Head of security. But more than that, a chance to build something better, safer, more honest than what we had before. Carter buckled Audrey into her booster seat, his movements automatic after years of practice. When he straightened, his decision was made. Monday morning, 8:30. Serena confirmed. We'll have your office ready. As Carter drove away, Audrey already deep in her new ocean book, he caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror of Serena standing in the garage, watching them leave. She looked smaller without the boardroom backdrop, more vulnerable, but also stronger somehow, as if surviving the morning's betrayal had refined something essential within her. The radio was already reporting the story, though the details were garbled, sensationalized beyond recognition. Federal investigation, corporate espionage, billions in intellectual property saved from theft. They would never know the full truth. The moment when a father's choice to protect a stranger had prevented a tragedy, when 4 simple words had changed the trajectory of multiple lives. Carter reached back to squeeze Audrey's knee, their signal that everything was okay. She squeezed back, without looking up from her book, already lost in stories of ocean depths and brave explorers. The morning sun broke through the parking garage exit, flooding the car with light that felt like possibility, like redemption, like the first day of something new and precious, and worth protecting. Behind them, Whitmore Holdings stood tall against the sky, its glass and steel no longer cold, but somehow warmed by the knowledge that within its walls, integrity had won a decisive victory. The company would survive, even thrive, but more importantly, it would do so honestly, protected by people who understood that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for money or power, but for the simple principle that when someone is threatened, when injustice looms, someone must stand up and say the words that matter. Hands off the lady. The phrase would become legend in certain circles, a reminder that courage doesn't always wear a uniform, that heroes sometimes come in unexpected packages, and that the line between right and wrong, when clearly drawn, is worth defending at any cost. But for Carter Miller, driving his daughter home on a Saturday morning that had become anything but routine, they were just words he had said when they needed to be said, nothing more or less than duty demanded. The story would continue, of course. There would be trials and testimonies, corporate restructuring, and new partnerships. Serena would transform Whitmore Holdings into a beacon of ethical business practice. Carter would build a security department that protected people as much as property. And perhaps, in quiet moments between board meetings and security briefings, 2 people who had found each other in the crucible of crisis would discover that trust, once forged in fire, could become something deeper, something worth protecting with the same fierce determination that had saved a company and stopped a conspiracy. But that was all in the future. For now, there was just a father and daughter driving home, sunlight streaming through windows, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, against all odds and despite all risks, the good guys win.